Hey guys, it's Mountain Walk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about Affinity. That's right, we got another deck, another crazy broken deck from ye old Magic. Although I guess this one has cards in the modern card frame, so I guess it's not that old, but that's okay. That's okay. Still old, still busted, still very notorious. Um, Definitely a really bad time for the game, and it kind of came out of nowhere, sort of. Really weird stuff. A lot of weird stuff going on actually around this time, right? Because we just get the card face change. We get a lot of like color pie shifting and things being removed from certain colors and all sorts of stuff going on. But Affinity, obviously, the craziest thing happened at this time. So let's get started. All right. This first came out, Affinity came out in Mirrodin, which was released on October 2nd, 2003. And at first, it was just like kind of random stuff, right? Things that aren't super obviously broken, right? So stuff like Tooth of Chiscoria or Scale of Chiscoria. This kind of stuff really not that scary, right? Pretty innocuous, pretty innocuous. There is stuff like Broodstar, of course. Broodstar is very cool, very awesome. Definitely a card I like to play. It's one of my favorite cards that came out. Like obviously wasn't really happy with the card face change at this time, but I did really like Broodstar. So when I was in school at that time, I was so excited. I would try to tell my friends, I'm like, whoa, this deck with Broodstar, and it's this thing, and it costs a little bit if you have a bunch of artifacts, and it gets big if you have a bunch of artifacts and all this stuff. And it was so cool. It was really fun. Not only Affinity, but equipment too. So a new artifact subtype came out in Mirrodin. This was really neat. A lot of stuff like Lightning Greaves, right? There's a famous card, still played a ton today in Commander, and saw a lot of constructed play too, actually. Um, and then there's like stuff like Ornithopter. I'm like, what the hell's going on? Like the only card I really liked in the Broodstar Affinity deck was Broodstar itself. It just played a bunch of other random crap, and I'm just like, I don't really like these cards. They're weird. Like, what is even going on? So yeah, kind of a, a weird time because it was like no one really expected what was going to happen, that this mechanic would turn out to be so insane, because most of the cards with Affinity, again minus of course Broodstar, just weren't scary really for the most part. There was some okay stuff, right? But a lot of it was a lot of the power was hidden, right? Because things like the artifact lands, which were like functioned as like pain-free, like ancient tombs, so it's like it really sort of changed the way you had to think about cards, and cost reduction and stuff like that, and how it relates to ramp. And because they learned their lesson from Saga last time, okay, no more grid monoliths and stuff, and no more Tolarian academies. We're just gonna put weird cards and these weird things to sort of work together and do weird stuff. you know and that was cool, sort of. uh, but yeah, this is a good lesson too, in about really this is sort of the beginning of a lot of decks, synergy based decks, right, versus just decks that are just care about like the raw cards or power level of any particular card. Say something like Jund, right, which is a sort of the best example of like a mid-range deck. It just wants really powerful cards that do really powerful stuff. Whereas like a lot of the Affinity decks ended up looking like just a pile of shit. But the way that the cards work together, the synergy, the cards were not what they seemed on the face of them. So everything was okay for a while, and then they released Darksteel, and everything immediately went to shit. And I mean everything. So what ends up happening at this time is, of course, they release one of the most busted cards in the last 20 years. Um, Certainly up there with something like Oko, or Mental Misstep for like really big big mistake. I'm sure you guys know what we're talking about, or what I'm talking about, but we'll get to that in a moment. Darkseer was released on February 6, 2004. And it induced a lot of really powerful stuff, things like Indestructible, first seen in Darksteel, which is really cool. Darksteel Colossus, right? This was a card that was used in Tooth and Nail and just all sorts of casual decks. That thing was sweet. But also Modular. Modular, very important ability, which we'll go into in a sec. But this one, again, also seemed a little innocuous, but ended up being very, very good, very, very powerful. Again, another one of these sort of like secret sort of synergy things going on. So a lot of really wonky stuff going on once Darksteel releases. That released a ton of really powerful cards into the format and subsequently to the Affinity deck that really made it take shape, and it was like just ridiculous off the bat. So let's go ahead and look at some of the cards that we're talking about here. Okay, so one that most people should be familiar with is Eighth of Vial. First released in Darksteel, this card was a total dark horse, right? It did take a little bit for it to catch on, but this thing is like a better Soul Ring in a lot of instances because it gives it flash, right? And then of course can more or less produce, right, colored mana, as well as making the effects uncounterable. So it turns off basically all counter magic on creatures. And of course, there's a lot of really interesting play, when to use it, when to activate it, do you tick up or leave it. So yeah, anyway, so Vial introduced here, and this is like, I mean, the best sort of example for this deck, because no one, I don't remember anyone at the time on the internet or otherwise really making a huge deal about this, but eventually became a mainstay in the Affinity deck. I mean, just not as good as it was in other places, right, or as we see like a lot of the Vial decks today, but still very powerful. Next up, of course, we got Chromatic Sphere. Again, the Affinity decks were typically multicolored, sometimes like 5 colors, sometimes less. So Chromatic Sphere did everything, right? Definitely kind of a nice glue card, right? Kind of gets everything started, gets the engine running, counts for Affinity, color fixes, cantrips, sacks to Ravager, of course. But let's talk about the real big 2-card combo here. We have Disciple of the Vault and Arcbound Ravager. So Ravager, of course, looking, again, not very scary, right, on the face of it. It has Modular 1, so it's 2 mana, 1/1 basically, and you can sack an artifact to pump it, to give it another counter. And of course, Disciple always triggers when an artifact is put into a graveyard from anywhere. So obviously very good in the mirror, but typically what it does is it teams up with Ravager to, like, you can kill out a combat, you can just do a ton of burst damage. Disciple, especially at certain points of the game, can turn off like mass removal, so things like a Chroma's Vengeance, like in Standard, or Pernicious Deed and Extended at the time. Very, very strong. This card is totally, I mean, with the artifact lands, it's like it's hard to describe, right? If you haven't really played with that version of the deck, right? With Disciple and Ravager and artifact lands, it's another thing entirely. It definitely makes like kind of a lose-lose situation. Like you obviously have to kill Ravager or like some of the other creatures, but if you do, you still are even losing life, and like every attack, it just you're getting closer and closer and closer to just this like it being like a 1-mana colorless fireball when you have like enough artifacts in play. 1-mana colorless uncounterable fireball, right? So yeah, just totally insane. Ravager, I mean, what can you say? This is, in my estimation, one of the most powerful creatures. Although obviously, like, you know, again, these kind of things are contextual. Like, obviously, historically, that's certainly the case, because more or less seen play in every single format. But specifically, just how good it is with, like, turning artifacts into damage, pumping it up, becoming resilient to removal, how well it works with counters and other artifact creatures, especially ones with modular. I mean, it's just putting all the extra counters on something like a Blink Moth Nexus. I mean, it just does everything. The thing is just ridiculous, right? It's just totally insane. A little less good these days due to various reasons, but and then of course, lastly, the last modular creature, again, very much like Chromatic Sphere, Arcbound Worker. This thing just, I mean, it put in work. I mean, it really did. Forgive the pun. But 1 mana, 1/1 modular, and this is wonderful because, again, you can sack at your Ravager to get a bunch of counters. If Ravager dies, you sack the Ravager to itself to avoid a removal spell or something. You can put the counters on the worker. Definitely really, really cool stuff. That just does a lot, right? It adds to Affinity, and again, everything just sort of works together. So this is really, really the big core, right? The Ravager Disciple plus all these other guys. All right, and one of the reasons the deck was able to do so well is the artifact lands. Specifically, stuff like Seed of Sidon, which is basically always played because of Thoughtcast, which we'll talk about in a sec. But these things, like I said, more or less colorless, or excuse me, painless ancient tombs of whatever particular color. I mean, it's just silly, right? Because they do double duty of tapping for mana as well as being an artifact to reduce the cost of affinity spells. Pretty silly stuff. Pretty silly stuff. Again, Sea of the Synod was always played because of Thoughtcast, which pretty much always cast for 1 mana, sometimes 2. Yeah, 1 mana draw 2 is way, way, way above curve, right, for this kind of effect. Pretty insane. Then we have another really important land, as we mentioned earlier. I mentioned earlier. Why do I say we? Anyways, because Blinkmoth Nexus, again, helps you avoid mass removal, like sorcery speed removal. And of course, like I said, you can put the counters on Ravager onto the Nexus. Definitely pretty sweet, and it can fly, of course, so it can get over ground stalls, carry equipment very well. Then we have Shrapnel Blast. Again, this is another thing that was a really big problem. People were never sure, like, okay, how much damage can they do to me? Do they have a Shrapnel Blast? Are they even playing it? Are they going to play another Disciple and double up on the triggers for Ravager? It's just like, I mean, you never really were safe because they could just do such obscene amounts of damage. Shrapnel Blast, very reminiscent of Fire Blast, except obviously you need a little bit different, right? It's not free, but yeah, like this thing is just 2 mana, 5 damage to anything is it's a good rate. It's a good rate. And of course, one of my favorite cards, again, very innocuous, but Welding Jar. This card is wonderful. Lets you regenerate stuff, which is totally good. Again, help you dodging removal, lets you save key artifacts. Again, costs nothing, helps with affinity. What do you need to say? What do you need to say? All right, and let's talk about some of the other affinity guys, the real actual creatures in the deck that were really led to some of the more busted starts. Of course, I'm talking about Frogmite and Mirror Enforcer. This is just great. You can just get enough dudes into play. Sometimes you can just like turn one like land, ornithopter, worker, Frogmite, and then you can like untap, play a land, play your Mirror Enforcer. I mean, just totally strong openings, right? Just got like so much power in play, and it was awesome. These are sort of the payoffs, right? Help you sort of chain up, get you some big boys. Like typically, playing turn one Grizzly Bear, for no drawback for no mana sometimes, right? Is really good, right? That's pretty powerful, you know. Especially back in the day, right, when creatures were a little worse. Now, that's not as great, right? If it was like a free wild Nikotl, that'd be sweet. But anyway, so yeah, Frogmite, pretty sweet, pretty strong card, at least back then, right? Having multiple Frogmites in play, very fun, definitely a good feeling. And of course, Mirror Enforcer, again, same sort of thing. Creatures were worse. This guy was often the biggest boy in the battlefield before even putting any equipment on it. Not much to say. Typically top of your curve. Only sometimes you played it for free, of course. That was the goal. But sometimes it's a couple mana, 2 or 3 mana, sometimes depending on your hand. And of course, we'll talk about a Tog. This might be kind of a weird one, but this was basically an additional sack outlet. Obviously, this guy did a pretty, like all the Togs that are playable, ate a ton of things and then got enormous, right? And so since basically everything in your deck is an artifact or draws into an artifact, this dude gets big fast. So he's definitely a little bit of nice redundancy against like, you know, if your Ravager dies, right? So you can still turn on your Disciple. And of course, sometimes he's even just better than Ravager just because everything's an artifact, eats it, and it's pretty sweet. But now let's get to the real part, like why was this deck so insane? And of course, I'm sure you guys, if you played Commander, you played with this card, right? Skull Clamp. Again, this is like the poster child, right? Of oops, we accidentally, you know, changed it at the last week of development before the set goes to print or whatever. And oopsie, you know, this is and more than that, right? They tried to literally make the card worse. Originally, it was like +1/+1, right? And they're like, oh nope, we gotta make it worse, so we'll make it hurt your creature, right? So +1/-1. Unfortunately, that turns it into a card drawing engine. And so like when you have all this other stuff, like start attaching this to like Arcbound Workers or Blink Moth Nexus or other things like Frogmites. I mean this is just insane. Put it on a Frogmite. It's okay. It's a 3/1. So they attack. Did they take the 3? I mean, you can't take 3 forever, right? So they block it. Well, you get like what, a 3-for-1 or something? So kill stuff, then you draw 2 when it dies. I mean, it's like, how is this? This is ridiculous. Again, putting in something like a Mirror Enforcer or like, yeah. It definitely creates a lot of really weird situations where it's like you have to kill their things because they're obviously a little bit bigger, more threatening. Or if they trade with your stuff, I mean, you just fall so far behind, it's like not even funny. Skull Clamp is definitely one of the most notorious cards in the game, especially with like how ubiquitous it was in Standard. You have like the Elfen Nail decks that played it, you had the Goblin decks that played it, and of course you had the Affinity decks that played it. It was literally just all like all Skull Clamp all the time, and it was just completely nuts, right? It was it was totally insane. I mean, it's hard, like I said, it's hard to say, right? Because how much of a mistake this was. And anytime you try to play fair against this card, it doesn't work, right? You just easily, like, just by playing the game, putting it on creatures, like it just ends up drawing you a bunch of cards, and it's just too hard for your opponent to fall or to catch up, right? Because it's one to play, one to equip. Um, what more can you say about Skull Clamp, right? Like I said, about as big as a mistake as something like Oko or Mental Misstep. Those are the ones that immediately come to mind as big mistakes. Although I guess some of the Del spells are pretty up there too, right? For just being completely out there, you know, like Treasure Cruise and whatnot. But definitely a huge mistake that was basically immediately banned, like in a couple months. So this is pretty fast. Like I said, they haven't really done any banning since Saga Block. So yeah, so they banned this guy in a couple months, and then a couple months later they released Fifth Dawn, and there's cranial plating, right? So now it's like now it's just even more turbo, like spam damage into you with my cranial platings on my Ornithopters, which aren't so scary, or aren't so silly looking, I should say, now when they're like 8/2 flyers. And then of course the double black to instant speed, move it around is really good at dodging removal. Again, just make the deck even more resilient to removal. So yeah, definitely this stuff all just worked together. It's just one big pile of synergy, right? So definitely pretty crazy, pretty crazy. So let's look at a couple different decks. This is one from, I believe, Worlds 2004. Yeah. So this one must have been like, gosh, because this one has plating, right? So I think it was around 2004. This is a pretty good one. Again, just a typical affinity list. You have stuff like Pyroclasm against the Elves or the Goblin decks in the sideboard. Mirror Retriever against decks that want to grind you out, and Relic Barrier and Electrostatic Bolt for the mirror, that kind of stuff. Again, nothing too weird here. Like I said, the Mirror Retriever might be a little wonky, but it is pretty good when you're getting like these slow sort of grindy games. Helps you against like mass removal or just removal in general. Definitely pretty sweet stuff. Pretty sweet stuff. Nothing too weird here, but this is a good example of the standard, no pun intended, the standard plating affinity sort of lists. Now this was a Skull Clamp list, and I think this one, obviously a little earlier, right, before it was banned. So this one was from Japanese Nationals, I believe, and Yeah, so this is, again, you see main deck welding jar here. Again, as a way to protect Skull Clamp. Obviously, that's a very good thing. Nothing too weird here. We see a little bit more main deck removal, E-Bolt, Electrostatic Bolt, right, just to take out random other guys. And like, for example, Mirror Enforcer, it's a 1-mana answer to that. That's good. And then, of course, 4 Shrapnel Blast. And then our 4 Thought Cast, and there you go. I mean, that's about it. Sideboard, we got some cool stuff like Genesis Chamber, which is obviously very good with Skull Clamp, Mana Leak, which is, well, it's Mana Leak, so it's good against decks that are trying to cast expensive cards against you. So not much more to say there, right? So yeah. Again, nothing too weird here. Definitely. Well, the only weird thing is, like I said, they printed Skull Clamp and they let you play with it for a couple months. I mean, that was a huge mistake. But man, it was fun. Actually, everyone really liked that format. It actually got worse because the Affinity deck didn't get that much worse. And then, of course, they printed Cranial Plating after that, and where the Elf and the Goblin decks, the Elf and Nail and whatever, they didn't really get anything from those other sets. So it actually made the banning actually made the format worse, oddly enough. And of course, this is from 2005. I think this was PT Columbus, Pierre Canale's Affinity list. This was an extended deck, as you can see by a lot of the cards in the sideboard. But really nothing too weird here. Well, actually there are a couple weird things. Let's talk about it. Obviously, you know what Slumber Hoverguard is. That was the guy on the opening slide. This guy, as well as our good friend Mirror Enforcer, were so good against the rock list because a lot of their stuff like Smother or Pernicious Deed couldn't hit them, or if they could, it took like 1,000,000 mana, right, to do that. And so these were really good against a lot of the prospective hate cards. Slumber Hoverguard being just a blue flyer and not like an artifact creature, again, helped it dodge stuff like Energy Flux and so on. So that was very good. That was very good. Really, really cool, really smart there. And then, of course, the other big thing was the main deck Meddling Mage. So this was to preempt a lot of the hate. So things like Energy Flux, Pulverize, Meltdown, like I said, Pernicious Deed, things like Serenity, I guess even like Aura of Silence, like all sorts of stuff that would just totally wreck your day. Because I mean, it would just literally destroy everything on the board, right? So Meddling Mage, very, very good here. Very clever use of Meddling Mage. This is in fact one of the first decks where we really see like Vile just doing so much good stuff. Because Vile, again, color fixing for Meddling Mage, putting it at instant speed, like you know, to sort of catch them off guard, and name stuff, right? Like if they vamp or whatever for a card. At end step, you can Vile and Meddling Mage or something to sort of cut it off before they can cast it, draw and cast it. So yeah, a lot of really cool stuff going on here. In the sideboard, we see stuff like City Brass. Again, this is just a common tactic, just because they're boarding in a lot of colored cards, right? And so it's just to help cast more spells. Again, really powerful cards against like red deck wins. So we have Chill, right? This is to basically shut them off from doing anything while you just beat the crap out of them. Because they had a ton of removal, things like Pillage, Burn Spells, Grim Lavamancer, so that could have ended up being an issue, but Chill solved that pretty easily. Cabal Therapy, Seal of Removal against just all sorts of different decks, right? Anything that's that wants to play like big stupid creatures, or Therapy obviously is very good against combo decks. Kami of Ancient Law is another card that was very good against things like Energy Flux and Pernicious Deed. So they'd have to pop it for less or whatever. So and of course it's a threat too, which was actually quite good. And of course E-Plague against goblins typically. So a lot of really cool stuff going on here. Definitely really sweet deck. Really sweet deck. All right. So what ended up happening? Well, as you can see, I could barely make this even intelligible. Like it just bans everywhere. So Skull Clamp was banned in Standard, Block, Extended, Legacy when that became a format later on. Singleton, right? I don't think I got that on here. There was this online Singleton format. Skull Clamp was banned. So it's like every single format that even mattered except for like Vintage. Then we have like, okay, Skull Clamp, and then in 2005 we have in standard, so Ravager, Disciple, and then all the artifact lands. And then extended in 2005 we have the banning of Aetherfile and Disciple. Well, and this was in response to Pierre Canale's win in extended at the time. So that deck we just looked at. So after that they banned File and Disciple. And it was like that until basically the format went away in favor of Modern in like 2011. And then, of course, in 2011, in Modern, they also banned Skull Clamp, of course. And then the Artifact lands, too, unfortunately. Very sad. And then 2006, Mirrored and Block Constructed, of course, they banned, like, File, Ravager, all the lands, and Disciple, too. So, I mean, cleaned house, right? Literally in every format. The deck was just pretty ridiculous. And so obviously they just, totally took him to the mattresses, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, basically it was dominated everything, it was the best deck everywhere, and so they had to do something. So, well, what happened, right? Let's do a post-mortem. What went wrong? What was going on? Well, a lot of the payoffs were too good, and they were a little bit sneaky, right? So stuff like Ravager, you know, obviously once you play with it and get a feel for the card, obviously it's very powerful, but like on its face, not that scary. Even something like, I would say, cranial plating, right? That one's a little more obvious. Like, okay, it's once you play with a lot of artifacts and you have a bunch of random dudes and maybe some black mana, like you can do stuff. So like that's cool, I guess, but they're a little sneaky, right? Their power isn't exactly obvious. And so there were also too many good enablers, again, chiefly the artifact lands, Aether Vial 2. So yeah, those were maybe not the most obvious ones. But the biggest thing is that the cost reduction is more or less like ramp spells, right? Like playing, Grim Monolith and Voltaic Key or something, or like Ancient Tomb and stuff like that. I mean, it really, they're two sides of the same coin. So the lessons they learned from Saga Block were true, right? They still held, they're like, okay, they didn't print any really ridiculous mana accelerants, right? With the exception of Aether Vial, right? But like it has very big deck building requirements, and it takes a while for it to ramp up. Obviously, like again, Skull Clamp was just a mistake in and of itself that, I mean, obviously had to be banned from everything because it was just like, just literally everything just evolves around it. Like if you're playing decks that play normal Magic games, like Skull Clamp is the best thing to be doing. If you can't play Skull Clamp, then you're doing it wrong. And there were no like other linear decks that could like go over the top of Skull Clamp because they're all those cards just didn't really exist for the most part. And of course, new card types, right? So like I said, equipment, Skull Clamp played into this. Same thing with cranial plating, of course, a little bit. So, I mean, I think this one's a little bit more understandable because like everything is just not obvious, right? Like you put like Ornithopter and like Arcbound work in your deck. I'm like, what is this shit? This looks like garbage. But that's obviously not the way it played, right? So, like, I think it's pretty obvious. Like, this isn't something we can really hold over their head too much. Like, obviously, it's not like Saga Block, right? It's not like, what's the color that needs the ramp the least? It's blue. Well, let's give them one of the best lands ever printed. Like Tolarian Academy. Like, just really like puzzling design decisions. So yeah, really, really, really weird stuff. So this one, I think it's a little bit more understandable, right? They wanted to make a really powerful, fun artifact block. So they're like, okay, let's just do all these little cute things that sort of interact well and do different things. And you want to play a bunch of random weird artifacts and zero mana artifacts. And oh, these lands are artifacts too. This is really neat and people like this. And unfortunately, they just didn't foresee how powerful it was, obviously. Otherwise, they wouldn't print the damn things. So yeah. Obviously things like Frogmite are not going to like set off any alarms. It's like, oh man, 4-mana 2/2s. Like they didn't understand or I guess see or foresee how powerful like free grizzly bears are. Like just dumping your hand into play super fast, and then like you know, playing a skull clamp or a cranial plating and going to town. So yeah, it's definitely pretty bad. And of course, it continued the long tradition of artifact blocks being ridiculous. I guess you could. I mean, obviously, this goes back to even antiquities, right? With stuff like well, antiquities had a lot of really ridiculous lands. It had what, workshop, factory, and strip mine. That's pretty good, right? And then some other ridiculous cards too in antiquities. But yeah, definitely. So yeah, this is the long tradition of artifact blocks being broken, which happened really even up until what, like Kaladesh, right? We still had a lot of issues with like more new subtypes, right? Vehicles and stuff just being way too pushed, like our good friend Looter Scooter, right? So yeah, these things are they're sort of unavoidable. They're trying to sort of fix it with colored artifacts. We'll see how well that works. But yeah. So I mean, there you have it. That's, I mean, that's the long and the short of it. All the stuff that looked like just a bunch of random crap put together actually wasn't random crap. It was actually all really good. So yeah, this is, I think, the first thing I saw that was like really, I'm like, wow, these things sort of work together and do this really cool thing. Like they all sort of build off each other. This sort of idea of synergy, which we saw a little bit with like in Goblins, right? And Onslaught Block when they released all those and like how they all work together, and like that was pretty cool. But this is like taking it to the max, right? Because even your lands are all artifacts, and so you could do stuff with them, right? They interact and make your spells cheaper, and they do all sorts of really ridiculous things. So yeah, definitely pretty crazy, definitely a pretty interesting lesson to learn. But yeah, so there you go, man. So yeah, that's basically it. I mean, you go on forever talking about these things. Definitely pretty sweet, pretty cool, pretty interesting. I really like Fandy. I'm fortunate that the deck's been definitely on the decline in modern for a really long time now. So yeah, not cool, not cool. But them's the breaks. You know, that's the way the cookie crumbles, as they say, or whatever. So, but yeah, so that's it, guys. That's it for today. So thanks for stopping by. I hope you had fun, and have a nice day.